Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of My Disillusionment in Russia by Emma Goldman. Chapter 4, Moscow. First Impressions.
Coming from Petrograd to Moscow is like being suddenly transferred from a desert to active life. So great is the contrast. On reaching the large open square in front of the main Moscow station, I was amazed at the sight of busy crowds, cabbies, and porters. The same picture presented itself all the way from the station to the Kremlin. The streets were alive with men, women, and children. Almost everybody carried a bundle or dragged a loaded sleigh. There was life, motion, and movement, quite different from the stillness that oppressed me in Petrograd. I noticed considerable display of the military in the city, and scores of men dressed in leather suits with guns in their belts. Czecha men are extraordinary commission, explained Radek. I had heard of the Czecha before. Petrograd talked of it with dread and hatred. However, the soldiers and Czechists were never much in evidence in the city on the Neva. Here in Moscow they seemed everywhere. Their presence reminded me of a remark Jack Reed had made. Moscow is a military encampment, he had said. Spies everywhere, the bureaucracy most autocratic. I always feel relieved when I get out of Moscow. But then Petrograd is a proletarian city and is permeated with the spirit of the revolution. Moscow always was hierarchical. It is much more so now. I found that Jack Reed was right. Moscow was indeed hierarchical. Still, the life was intense, varied, and interesting. What struck me most forcibly, besides the display of militarism, was the preoccupation of the people. There seemed to be no common interest between them. Everyone rushed about as a detached unit in quest of his own, pushing and knocking against everyone else. Repeatedly, I saw women or children fall from exhaustion without anyone stopping to lend assistance. People stared at me when I would bend over the heap on the slippery pavement or gather up the bundles that had fallen into the street. I spoke to friends about what looked to me like a strange lack of fellow feeling. They explained it as a result, partly of the general distrust and suspicion created by the Czecha, and partly due to the absorbing task of getting the day's food. One had neither vitality nor feeling left to think of others. Yet there did not seem to be such a scarcity of food as in Petrograd, and the people were warmer and better dressed. I spent much time on the streets and in the marketplaces. Most of the latter, as also the famous Sukharevka, were in full operation. Occasionally soldiers would raid the markets, but as a rule, they were suffered to continue. They presented the most vital and interesting part of the city's life. Here gathered proletarian and aristocrat, communist and bourgeois, peasant and intellectual. Here they were bound by the common desire to sell and buy, to trade and bargain. Here one could find for sale a rusty iron pot alongside of an exquisite icon, an old pair of shoes and intricately worked lace, a few yards of cheap calico, and a beautiful old Persian shawl. The rich of yesterday, hungry and emaciated, denuding themselves of their last glories. The rich of today buying it was indeed an amazing picture in revolutionary Russia. Who was buying the finery of the past, and where did the purchasing power come from? The buyers were numerous. In Moscow, one was not so limited as to sources of information as in Petrograd. The very streets furnished that source. The Russian people, even after 4 years of war and 3 years of revolution, remained unsophisticated. They were suspicious of strangers and reticent at first. But when they learned that one had come from America and did not belong to the governing political party, they gradually lost their reserve. Much information I gathered from them, and some explanation of the things that perplexed me since my arrival. I talked frequently with the workers and peasants and the women on the markets. The forces which had led up to the Russian Revolution had remained terra incognita to these simple folk. But the revolution itself had struck deep into their souls. They knew nothing of theories, but they believed that there was to be no more of the hated baron, master, and now the baron was again upon them. The baron has everything, they would say, white bread, clothing, even chocolate, while we have nothing. Communism, equality, freedom, they jeered, lies and deception. I would return to the national bruised and battered, my illusions gradually shattered, my foundations crumbling. But I would not let go. After all, I thought, the common people could not understand the tremendous difficulties confronting the Soviet government. the imperialist forces arraigned against Russia, the many attacks which drained her of her men who otherwise would be employed in productive labor, the blockade which was relentlessly slaying Russia's young and weak. Of course, the people could not understand these things, and I must not be misled by their bitterness born of suffering. I must be patient. I must get to the source of the evils confronting me. The National, like the Petrograd Astoria, was a former hotel but not nearly in as good condition. No rations were given out there except 3/4 of a pound of bread every 2 days. Instead, there was a common dining room where dinners and suppers were served. The meals consisted of soup and a little meat, sometimes fish or pancakes, and tea. In the evening, we usually had kasha and tea. The food was not too plentiful, but one could exist on it were it not so abominably prepared. I saw no reason for this spoiling of provisions. Visiting the kitchen, I discovered an array of servants controlled by a number of officials, commandants, and inspectors. The kitchen staff were poorly paid. Moreover, they were not given the same food served to us. They resented this discrimination, and their interest was not in their work. This situation resulted in much graft and waste, criminal in the face of the general scarcity of food. Few of the tenants of the National, I learned, took their meals in the common dining room. They prepared or had their meals prepared by servants in a separate kitchen set aside for that purpose. There, as in the Astoria, I found the same scramble for a place on the stove, the same bickering and quarreling, the same greedy, envious watching of each other. Was that communism in action, I wondered? I heard the usual explanation: Yudenich, Denikin, Kolchak, the blockade. But the stereotyped phrases no longer satisfied me. Before I left Petrograd, Jack Reed said to me, "When you reach Moscow, look up Angelika Balabanova. She will receive you gladly and will put you up should you be unable to find a room." I had heard of Balabanova before, knew of her work, and was naturally anxious to meet her. A few days after reaching Moscow, I called her up. Would she see me? Yes, at once, though she was not feeling well. I found Balabanova in a small, cheerless room, lying huddled up on the sofa. She was not prepossessing, but for her eyes, large and luminous, radiating sympathy and kindness. She received me most graciously, like an old friend, and immediately ordered the inevitable samovar. Over our tea we talked of America, the labor movement there, our deportation, and finally about Russia. I put to her the questions I had asked many communists regarding the contrasts and discrepancies which confronted me at every step. She surprised me by not giving the usual excuses. She was the first who did not repeat the old refrain. She did refer to the scarcity of food, fuel, and clothing, which was responsible for much of the graft and corruption. But on the whole, she thought life itself mean and limited. A rock on which the highest hopes are shattered. Life thwarts the best intentions and breaks the finest spirits, she said. Rather an unusual view for a Marxian, a communist, and one in the thick of the battle. I knew she was then secretary of the Third International. Here was a personality, one who was not a mere echo, one who felt deeply the complexity of the Russian situation. I went away profoundly impressed and attracted by her sad, luminous eyes. I soon discovered that Balabanova, or Balabanov as she preferred to be called, was at the beck and call of everybody. Though poor in health and engaged in many functions, she yet found time to minister to the needs of her legion callers. Often she went without necessaries herself, giving away her own rations, always busy trying to secure medicine or some little delicacy for the sick and suffering. Her special concern were the stranded Italians, of whom there were quite a number in Petrograd and Moscow. Balabanova had lived and worked in Italy for many years until she almost became Italian herself. She felt deeply with them, who were as far away from their native soil as from events in Russia. She was their friend, their advisor, their main support in a world of strife and struggle. Not only the Italians, but almost everyone else was the concern of this remarkable little woman. No one needed a communist membership card to Angelika's heart. No wonder some of her comrades considered her a sentimentalist who wasted her precious time in philanthropy. Many verbal battles I had on this score, with the type of communist who had become callous and hard, altogether barren of the qualities which characterized the Russian idealist of the past. Similar criticism as of Balabanova I heard expressed of another leading communist, Lunacharsky. Already in Petrograd, I was told sneeringly, Lunacharsky is a scatterbrain who wastes millions on foolish ventures. But I was eager to meet the man who was the commissar of one of the important departments in Russia, that of education. Presently, an opportunity presented itself. The Kremlin, the old citadel of Tsardom, I found heavily guarded and inaccessible to the common man. But I had come by appointment, and in the company of a man who had an admission card, and therefore passed the guard without trouble. We soon reached the Lunacharsky apartments, situated in an old, quaint building within the walls. Though the reception room was crowded with people waiting to be admitted, Lunacharsky called me in as soon as I was announced. His greeting was very cordial. Did I intend to remain a free bird was one of his first questions, or would I be willing to join him in his work? I was rather surprised. Why should one have to give up his freedom, especially in educational work? Were not initiative and freedom essential? However, I had come to learn from Lunacharsky about the revolutionary system of education in Russia, of which we had heard so much in America. I was especially interested in the care the children were receiving. The Moscow Pravda, like the Petrograd newspapers, had been agitated by a controversy about the treatment of the morally defective. I expressed surprise at such an attitude in Soviet Russia. Of course, it is all barbarous and antiquated, Lunacharsky said, and I am fighting it tooth and nail. The sponsors of prisons for children are old criminal jurists, still imbued with czarist methods. I have organized a commission of physicians, pedagogues, and psychologists to deal with this question. Of course, those children must not be punished. I felt tremendously relieved. Here at last was a man who had gotten away from the cruel old methods of punishment. I told him of the splendid work done in capitalist America by Judge Lindsay and of some of the experimental schools for backward children. Lunacharsky was much interested. Yes, that is just what we want here, the American system of education, he exclaimed. You surely do not mean the American public school system? I asked. You know of the insurgent movement in America against our public school method of education, the work done by Professor Dewey and others? Lunacharsky had heard little about it. Russia had been so long cut off from the Western world, and there was great lack of books on modern education. He was eager to learn of the new ideas and methods. I sensed in Lunacharsky a personality full of faith and devotion to the revolution, one who was carrying on the great work of education in a physically and spiritually difficult environment. He suggested the calling of a conference of teachers if I would talk to them about the new tendencies in education in America, to which I readily consented. Schools and other institutions in his charge were to be visited later. I left Lunacharsky filled with new hope. I would join him in his work, I thought. What greater service could one render the Russian people? During my visit to Moscow, I saw Lunacharsky several times. He was always the same kindly, gracious man, but I soon began to notice that he was being handicapped in his work by forces within his own party. Most of his good intentions and decisions never saw the light. Evidently, Lunacharsky was caught in the same machine that apparently held everything in its iron grip. What was that machine? Who directed its movements? Although the control of visitors at the National was very strict, no one being able to go in or out without a special propusc, permit, men and women of different political factions managed to call on me. Anarchists, left social revolutionists, cooperators, and people I had known in America and who had returned to Russia to play their part in the revolution. They had come with deep faith and high hope, but I found almost all of them discouraged, some even embittered. Though widely differing in their political views, nearly all of my callers related an identical story, the story of the high tide of the revolution, of the wonderful spirit that led the people forward, of the possibilities of the masses, the role of the Bolsheviki as the spokesman of the most extreme revolutionary slogans, and their betrayal of the revolution after they had secured power. All spoke of the Brest-Litovsk peace as the beginning of the downward march. The left social revolutionists especially, men of culture and earnestness who had suffered much under the Tsar and now saw their hopes and aspirations thwarted, were most emphatic in their condemnation. They supported their statements by evidence of the havoc wrought by the methods of forcible requisition and the punitive expeditions to the villages, of the abyss created between town and country, the hatred engendered between peasant and worker. They told of the persecution of their comrades, the shooting of innocent men and women, the criminal inefficiency, waste, and destruction. How, then, could the Bolsheviki maintain themselves in power? After all, they were only a small minority, about 500,000 members as an exaggerated estimate. The Russian masses, I was told, were exhausted by hunger and cowed by terrorism. Moreover, they had lost faith in all parties and ideas. Nevertheless, there were frequent peasant uprisings in various parts of Russia, but these were ruthlessly quelled. There were also constant strikes in Moscow, Petrograd, and other industrial centers, but the censorship was so rigid, little ever became known to the masses at large. I sounded my visitors on intervention. "We want none of outside interference," was the uniform sentiment. They held that it merely strengthened the hands of the Bolsheviki. They felt that they could not publicly even speak out against them so long as Russia was being attacked, much less fight their regime. Have not their tactics and methods been imposed on the Bolsheviki by intervention and blockade? I argued. Only partly so, was the reply. Most of their methods spring from their lack of understanding of the character and the needs of the Russian people and the mad obsession of dictatorship, which is not even the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship of a small group over the proletariat. When I broached the subject of the People's Soviets and the elections, my visitors smiled. Elections? There are no such things in Russia, unless you call threats and terrorism elections. It is by these alone that the Bolsheviki secure a majority. A few Mensheviki, social revolutionists, or anarchists are permitted to slip into the Soviets, but they have not the shadow of a chance to be heard. The picture painted looked black and dismal. Still I clung to my faith.
Chapter 5. Meeting People.
At a conference of the Moscow anarchists in March, I first learned of the part some anarchists had played in the Russian Revolution. In the July uprising of 1917, the Kronstadt sailors were led by the anarchist Yarchuk. The Constituent Assembly was dispersed by Zheleznyakov. The anarchists had participated on every front and helped to drive back the Allied attacks. It was the consensus of opinion that the anarchists were always among the first to face fire, as they were also the most active in the reconstructive work. One of the biggest factories near Moscow, which did not stop work during the entire period of the revolution, was managed by an anarchist. Anarchists were doing important work in the Foreign Office and in all other departments. I learned that the anarchists had virtually helped the Bolsheviki into power. 5 months later, in April 1918, machine guns were used to destroy the Moscow Anarchist Club and to suppress their press. That was before Mirbach arrived in Moscow. The field had to be cleared of disturbing elements, and the anarchists were the first to suffer. Since then, the persecution of the anarchists has never ceased. The Moscow Anarchist Conference was critical not only toward the existing regime, but toward its own comrades as well. It spoke frankly of the negative sides of the movement and of its lack of unity and cooperation during the revolutionary period. Later, I was to learn more of the internal dissensions in the anarchist movement. Before closing, the conference decided to call on the Soviet government to release the imprisoned anarchists and to legalize anarchist educational work. The conference asked Alexander Berkman and myself to sign the resolution to that effect. It was a shock to me that anarchists should ask any government to legalize their efforts, but I still believed the Soviet government to be at least to some extent expressive of the revolution. I signed the resolution, and as I was to see Lenin in a few days, I promised to take the matter up with him. The interview with Lenin was arranged by Balabanova. "You must see Ilyich. Talk to him about the things that are disturbing you and the work you would like to do," she had said. But some time passed before the opportunity came. At last, one day, Balabanova called up to ask whether I could go at once. Lenin had sent his car, and we were quickly driven over to the Kremlin, passed without question by the guards, and at last ushered into the workroom of the all-powerful president of the People's Commissars. When we entered, Lenin held a copy of the brochure Trial and Speeches in his hands. I had given my only copy to Balabanova, who had evidently sent the booklet on ahead of us to Lenin. One of his first questions was, When could the social revolution be expected in America? I had been asked the question repeatedly before, but I was astounded to hear it from Lenin. It seemed incredible that a man of his information should know so little about conditions in America. My Russian at this time was halting, but Lenin declared that though he had lived in Europe for many years, he had not learned to speak foreign languages. The conversation would therefore have to be carried on in Russian. At once he launched into a eulogy of our speeches in court. "What a splendid opportunity for propaganda," he said. "It is worth going to prison if the courts can so successfully be turned into a forum." I felt his steady, cold gaze upon me, penetrating my very being, as if he were reflecting upon the use I might be put to. Presently he asked what I would want to do. I told him I would like to repay America what it had done for Russia. I spoke of the Society of the Friends of Russian Freedom, organized 30 years ago by George Kennan and later reorganized by Alice Stone Blackwell and other liberal Americans. I briefly sketched the splendid work they had done to arouse interest in the struggle for Russian freedom and the great moral and financial aid the society had given through all those years. To organize a Russian Society for American Freedom was my plan. Lenin appeared enthusiastic. "That is a great idea, and you shall have all the help you want. But, of course, it will be under the auspices of the Third International. Prepare your plan in writing and send it to me." I broached the subject of the anarchists in Russia. I showed him a letter I had received from Martins, the Soviet representative in America, shortly before my deportation. Martins asserted that the anarchists in Russia enjoyed full freedom of speech and press. Since my arrival, I found scores of anarchists in prison and their press suppressed. I explained that I could not think of working with the Soviet government so long as my comrades were in prison for opinion's sake. I also told him of the resolutions of the Moscow Anarchist Conference. He listened patiently and promised to bring the matter to the attention of his party. "But as to free speech," he remarked, "that is, of course, a bourgeois notion. There can be no free speech in a revolutionary period. We have the peasantry against us because we can give them nothing in return for their bread. We will have them on our side when we have something to exchange. Then you can have all the free speech you want, but not now. Recently we needed peasants to cart some wood into the city. They demanded salt. We thought we had no salt, but then we discovered 70 poods in Moscow in one of our warehouses. At once the peasants were willing to cart the wood. Your comrades must wait until we can meet the needs of the peasants. Meanwhile, they should work with us. Look at William Shatov, for instance, who has helped save Petrograd from Yudenich. He works with us and we appreciate his services. Shatov was among the first to receive the Order of the Red Banner." Free speech, free press, the spiritual achievements of centuries, what were they to this man? A Puritan, he was sure his scheme alone could redeem Russia. Those who served his plans were right. The others could not be tolerated. A shrewd Asiatic, this Lenin. He knows how to play on the weak sides of men by flattery, rewards, medals. I left convinced that his approach to people was purely utilitarian, for the use he could get out of them for his scheme. And his scheme, was it the revolution? I prepared the plan for the Society of the Russian Friends of American Freedom and elaborated the details of the work I had in mind, but refused to place myself under the protecting wing of the Third International. I explained to Lenin that the American people had little faith in politics, and would certainly consider it an imposition to be directed and guided by a political machine from Moscow. I could not consistently align myself with the Third International. Some time later, I saw Chicherin. I believe it was 4 a.m. when our interview took place. He also asked about the possibilities of a revolution in America, and seemed to doubt my judgment when I informed him that there was no hope of it in the near future. We spoke of the IWW, which had evidently been misrepresented to him. I assured Chicherin that while I am not an IWW, I must state that they represented the only conscious and effective revolutionary proletarian organization in the United States, and were sure to play an important role in the future labor history of the country. Next to Balabanova, Chicherin impressed me as the most simple and unassuming of the leading communists in Moscow. but all were equally naive in their estimate of the world outside of Russia. Was their judgment so faulty because they had been cut off from Europe and America so long? Or was their great need of European help father to their wish? At any rate, they all clung to the idea of approaching revolutions in the Western countries, forgetful that revolutions are not made to order, and apparently unconscious that their own revolution had been twisted out of shape and semblance and was gradually being done to death. The editor of the London Daily Herald, accompanied by one of his reporters, had preceded me to Moscow. They wanted to visit Kropotkin, and they had been given a special car. Together with Alexander Berkman and a Shapiro, I was able to join Mr. Lansbury. The Kropotkin cottage stood back in the garden, away from the street. Only a faint ray from a kerosene lamp lit up the path to the house. Kropotkin received us with his characteristic graciousness, evidently glad at our visit. But I was shocked at his altered appearance. The last time I had seen him was in 1907, in Paris, which I visited after the Anarchist Congress in Amsterdam. Kropotkin, barred from France for many years, had just been given the right to return. He was then 65 years of age, but still so full of life and energy that he seemed much younger. Now he looked old and worn. I was eager to get some light from Kropotkin on the problems that were troubling me, particularly on the relation of the Bolsheviki to the revolution. What was his opinion? Why had he been silent so long? I took no notes, and therefore I can give only the gist of what Kropotkin said. He stated that the revolution had carried the people to great spiritual heights and had paved the way for profound social changes. If the people had been permitted to apply their released energies, Russia would not be in her present condition of ruin. The Bolsheviki, who had been carried to the top by the revolutionary wave, first caught the popular ear by extreme revolutionary slogans, thereby gaining the confidence of the masses and the support of militant revolutionists. He continued to narrate that early in the October period, the Bolsheviki began to subordinate the interests of the revolution to the establishment of their dictatorship, which coerced and paralyzed every social activity. He stated that the cooperatives were the main medium that could have bridged the interests of the peasants and the workers. The cooperatives were among the first to be crushed. He spoke with much feeling of the oppression, the persecution, the hounding of every shade of opinion, and cited numerous instances of the misery and distress of the people. He emphasized that the Bolsheviki had discredited socialism and communism in the eyes of the Russian people. Why haven't you raised your voice against these evils, against this machine that is sapping the lifeblood of the revolution? I asked. He gave 2 reasons. As long as Russia was being attacked by the combined imperialists and Russian women and children were dying from the effects of the blockade, he could not join the shrieking chorus of the ex-revolutionists in the cry of "Crucify." He preferred silence. Secondly, there was no medium of expression in Russia itself. To protest to the government was useless. Its concern was to maintain itself in power. It could not stop at such trifles as human rights or human lives. Then he added, "We have always pointed out the effects of Marxism in action. Why be surprised now?" I asked Kropotkin whether he was noting down his impressions and observations. Surely he must see the importance of such a record to his comrades and to the workers, in fact, to the whole world. "No," he said, "it is impossible to write when one is in the midst of great human suffering, when every hour brings new tragedies. Then there may be a raid at any moment. The Czecha comes swooping down in the night, ransacks every corner, turns everything inside out, and marches off with every scrap of paper. Under such constant stress, it is impossible to keep records. But besides these considerations, there is my book on ethics. I can only work a few hours a day, and I must concentrate on that to the exclusion of everything else." After a tender embrace which Peter never failed to give those he loved, we returned to our car. My heart was heavy, my spirit confused and troubled by what I had heard. I was also distressed by the poor state of health of our comrade. I feared he could not survive till spring. The thought that Peter Kropotkin might go to his grave and that the world might never know what he thought of the Russian Revolution was appalling.
Chapter 6. Preparing for American Deportees.
Events in Moscow, quickly following each other, were full of interest. I wanted to remain in that vital city, but as I had left all my effects in Petrograd, I decided to return there and then come back to Moscow to join Lunasharsky in his work. A few days before my departure, a young woman, an anarchist, came to visit me. She was from the Petrograd Museum of the Revolution, and she called to inquire whether I would take charge of the museum branch work in Moscow. She explained that the original idea of the museum was due to the famous old revolutionist Vera Nikolaevna Figner, and that it had recently been organized by nonpartisan elements. The majority of the men and women who worked in the museum were not communists, she said, but they were devoted to the revolution and anxious to create something which could, in the future, serve as a source of information and inspiration to earnest students of the Great Russian Revolution. When my caller was informed that I was about to return to Petrograd, she invited me to visit the museum and to become acquainted with its work. Upon my arrival in Petrograd, I found unexpected work awaiting me. Zorin informed me that he had been notified by Chicherin that 1,000 Russians had been deported from America and were on their way to Russia. They were to be met at the border and quarters were to be immediately prepared for them in Petrograd. Zorin asked me to join the commission about to be organized for that purpose. The plan of such a commission for American deportees had been broached to Zorin soon after our arrival in Russia. At that time, Zorin directed us to talk the matter over with Chicherin, which we did, but 3 months passed without anything having been done about it. Meanwhile, our comrades of the Buford were still walking from department to department, trying to be placed where they might do some good. They were a sorry lot, those men who had come to Russia with such high hopes, eager to render service to the revolutionary people. Most of them were skilled workers, mechanics men Russia needed badly, but the cumbersome Bolshevik machine and general inefficiency made it a very complex matter to put them to work. Some had tried independently to secure jobs, but they could accomplish very little. Moreover, those who found employment were soon made to feel that the Russian workers resented the eagerness and intensity of their brothers from America. "Wait till you have starved as long as we," they would say. "Wait till you have tasted the blessings of commissarship, and we will see if you are still so eager." In every way, the deportees were discouraged and their enthusiasm dampened. To avoid this unnecessary waste of energy and suffering, the commission was at last organized in Petrograd. It consisted of Ravitch, the then Minister of Internal Affairs for the Northern District, her secretary, Kaplan, 2 members of the Bureau of War Prisoners, Alexander Berkman, and myself. The new deportees were due in 2 weeks, and much work was to be done to prepare for their reception. It was unfortunate that no active participation could be expected from Ravitch because her time was too much occupied. Besides holding the post of Minister of the Interior, she was chief of the Petrograd militia, and she also represented the Moscow Foreign Office in Petrograd. Her regular working hours were from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. Kaplan, a very able administrator, had charge of the entire internal work of the department and could therefore give us very little of his time. There remained only 4 persons to accomplish within a short time the big task of preparing living quarters for 1,000 deportees in starved and ruined Russia. Moreover, Alexander Berkman, heading the reception committee, had to leave for the Latvian border to meet the exiles. It was an almost impossible task for one person, but I was very anxious to save the second group of deportees the bitter experiences and the disappointments of my fellow companions of the Buford. I could undertake the work only by making the condition that I be given the right of entry to the various government departments, for I had learned by that time how paralyzing was the effect of the bureaucratic red tape which delayed and often frustrated the most earnest and energetic efforts. Kaplan consented. "Call on me at any time for anything you may require," he said. "I will give orders that you be admitted everywhere and supplied with everything you need. If that should not help, call on the Czecha," he added. I had never called upon the police before, I informed him. Why should I do so in revolutionary Russia? "In bourgeois countries, that is a different matter," explained Kaplan. "With us, the Czecha defends the revolution and fights sabotage." I started on my work determined to do without the Czecha. Surely there must be other methods, I thought, then began a chase over Petrograd. Materials were very scarce, and it was most difficult to procure them owing to the unbelievably centralized Bolshevik methods. Thus, to get a pound of nails, one had to file applications in about 10 or 15 bureaus. To secure some bed linen or ordinary dishes, one wasted days. Everywhere in the offices, crowds of government employees stood about smoking cigarettes, awaiting the hour when the tedious task of the day would be over. My co-workers of the War Prisoners Bureau fumed at the irritating and unnecessary delays, but to no purpose. They threatened with the Czecha, with the concentration camp, even with Rastrel, shooting. The latter was the most favorite argument. Whenever any difficulty arose, one immediately heard Rastreliat to be shot. But the expression, so terrible in its significance, was gradually losing its effect upon the people. Man gets used to everything. I decided to try other methods. I would talk to the employees in the departments about the vital interest the conscious American workers felt in the Great Russian Revolution and of their faith and hope in the Russian proletariat. The people would become interested immediately, but the questions they would ask were as strange as they were pitiful. Have the people enough to eat in America? How soon will the revolution be there? Why did you come to starving Russia? They were eager for information and news, these mentally and physically starved people, cut off by the barbarous blockade from all touch with the Western world. Things American were something wonderful to them. A piece of chocolate or a cracker were unheard of dainties. They proved the key to everybody's heart. Within 2 weeks, I succeeded in procuring most of the things needed for the expected deportees, including furniture, linen, and dishes. A miracle, everybody said. However, the renovation of the houses that were to serve as living quarters for the exiles was not accomplished so easily. I inspected what, as I was told, had once been first-class hotels. I found them located in the former prostitute district. Cheap dives they were, until the Bolsheviki closed all brothels. They were germ-eaten, ill-smelling, and filthy. It was no small problem to turn those dark holes into a fit habitation within 2 weeks. A coat of paint was a luxury not to be thought of. There was nothing else to do but to strip the rooms of furniture and draperies and have them thoroughly cleaned and disinfected. One morning, a group of forlorn-looking creatures in charge of 2 militiamen were brought to my temporary office. They came to work, I was informed. The group consisted of a one-armed old man, a consumptive woman, and 8 boys and girls, mere children, pale, starved, and in rags. "Where do these unfortunates come from?" I inquired. "They are speculators," one of the militiamen replied. "We rounded them up on the market." The prisoners began to weep. They were no speculators, they protested. They were starving, they had received no bread in 2 days. They were compelled to go out to the market to sell matches or thread to secure a little bread. In the midst of this scene, the old man fainted from exhaustion, demonstrating better than words that he had speculated only in hunger. I had seen such speculators before, driven in groups through the streets of Moscow and Petrograd by convoys with loaded guns pointed at the backs of the prisoners. I could not think of having the work done by these starved creatures. But the militiamen insisted that they would not let them go. They had orders to make them work. I called up Kaplan and informed him that I considered it out of the question to have quarters for American deportees prepared by Russian convicts whose only crime was hunger. Thereupon Kaplan ordered the group set free and consented that I give them of the bread sent for the workers' rations. But a valuable day was lost. The next morning, a group of boys and girls came singing along the Nevsky Prospect. They were Cursanti from the Tauride Palace, who were sent to my office to work. On my first visit to the palace, I had been shown the quarters of the Cursanti, the students of the Bolshevik Academy. They were mostly village boys and girls, housed, fed, clothed, and educated by the government, later to be placed in responsible positions in the Soviet regime. At the time I was impressed by the institutions, but by April I had looked somewhat beneath the surface. I recalled what a young woman, a communist, had told me in Moscow about these students. "They are the special caste now being reared in Russia," she had said. "Like the church which maintains and educates its religious priesthood, our government trains a military and civic priesthood. They are a favored lot. I had more than one occasion to convince myself of the truth of it. The Cursanti were being given every advantage and many special privileges. They knew their importance, and they behaved accordingly. Their first demand, when they came to me, was for the extra rations of bread they had been promised. This demand satisfied, they stood about and seemed to have no idea of work. It was evident that whatever else the Cursanti might be taught, it was not to labor. But then, few people in Russia know how to work. The situation looked hopeless. Only 10 days remained till the arrival of the deportees, and the hotels, assigned for their use, were still in as uninhabitable a condition as before. It was no use to threaten with the Czecha as my co-workers did. I appealed to the boys and girls in the spirit of the American deportees who were about to arrive in Russia, full of enthusiasm for the revolution and eager to join in the great work of reconstruction. The Cursanti were the pampered charges of the government, but they were not long from the villages, and they had had no time to become corrupt. My appeal was effective. They took up the work with a will, and at the end of 10 days the 3 famous hotels were ready as far as willingness to work and hot water without soap could make them. We were very proud of our achievement, and we eagerly awaited the arrival of the deportees. At last they came, but to our great surprise, they proved to be no deportees at all. They were Russian war prisoners from Germany. The misunderstanding was due to the blunder of some official in Chicherin's office who misread the radio information about the party due at the border. The prepared hotels were locked and sealed. They were not to be used for the returned war prisoners because they were prepared for American deportees who still might come. All the efforts and labor had been in vain.
This concludes today's reading of My Disillusionment in Russia, by Emma Goldman. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.